for words. Is this your car? And depending on what comes out of your mouth in the next 5 seconds, you have either ended the encounter or opened a door that leads straight to a search, a seizure, and in some cases an arrest, all without the officer ever having had an independent legal basis for any of it. Yes hands him everything he needs to run your name, your license, your registration, your insurance, your warrant status, and your entire vehicle history through a system that will surface every flag, every lapse, and every prior contact you have ever had. No hands him a claimed ownership discrepancy that he will use to justify a deeper investigation of why you are driving a car you say is not yours. And the answer that most drivers instinctively reach for, the honest, simple, seemingly harmless truth, is the one that has produced more vehicle searches, more arrests, and more criminal charges from a forward question than almost any other opener at a traffic stop. This video is not about what to lie. It is about what the question is actually asking, what the law says you are required to answer, and what you say instead. Subscribe to this channel right now, because the video after this one covers what happens when the ownership question leads directly to a registration discrepancy investigation. And that escalation has its own legal architecture that every driver operating someone else's vehicle needs to understand before they ever get behind the wheel. Before the words, you need to understand what is this your car is actually asking, because the question sounds like a formality, and it is anything but. On its surface, the question appears to be an administrative clarification. The officer wants to know whether the person driving the vehicle is the registered owner. In reality, the question is the opening move of a multi-purpose investigative sequence that uses your answer to accomplish several simultaneous goals. The first goal is identity confirmation. If you say yes, the officer now has your verbal acknowledgement that you are the registered owner of record. He will cross-reference that against what the license plate query already returned, and any discrepancy between your answer and the registration database becomes an inconsistency in the record. If the car is not registered to your name, if it is registered to a family member, a friend, a company, a dealer, your yes is a false statement on a law enforcement contact. The second goal is consent priming. The is this your car question is frequently the precursor to can I search the vehicle. An affirmative answer to the ownership question establishes your authority to consent to a search. A person who acknowledges they own or control a vehicle has the legal authority to consent to its search. The consent request comes after the ownership confirmation because the officer needs to establish that the person consenting has the authority to do so. Your yes to is this your car is the predicate to your yes to can I search it. The third goal is narrative anchoring. Your answer establishes the first factual claim of the encounter in the officer's report. Everything that follows, your account of your movements, your explanation of your passengers, your response to questions about the vehicle's contents, is anchored to the ownership claim you just made. If any subsequent fact contradicts that anchor, you have a documented inconsistency. And documented inconsistencies are what prosecutors use to build credibility challenges at trial. Here is the specific scenario that the is this your car question most reliably produces, and it is the one that affects a far larger population of drivers than most people realize. A significant percentage of the vehicles on American roads at any given time are not being driven by their registered owner. The vehicle belongs to a spouse, a parent, a sibling, a friend, an employer. It was recently purchased and has not yet been retitled. It is a rental. It is a company car. It is a car borrowed for the day. It is a vehicle in the process of a private sale that has not been formally transferred. In every one of those scenarios, a driver who answers yes to is this your car has made a false statement, because the vehicle is not registered in their name. And a driver who answers no has triggered the follow-up investigation. Whose car is it? Do you have permission to drive it? Why don't you have documentation of that permission? Where is the owner? Can we contact them? Both answers produce an investigation. The only answer that does not produce an investigation is the one that removes the premise of the question. The answer that neither confirms nor denies ownership, and that places the encounter back on its required constitutional footing. The registration discrepancy is one of the most commonly cited justifications for extending a traffic stop beyond its original purpose. Rodriguez versus United States requires independent reasonable suspicion to extend a stop, but a driver who has just created a documented ownership discrepancy through their own inconsistent answer has provided that independent basis. The discrepancy is the justification. The driver created it. Here is the pipeline that the ownership confirmation most reliably initiates, and tracing it from beginning to end makes the forward question feel as consequential as it actually is. The officer asks, "Is this your car?" The driver confirms ownership. The officer now has an established owner of record on camera. The officer transitions. "Mind if I take a look in the vehicle?" The driver, who has already said yes once, who is in a compliant register, who believes the search will confirm their innocence, says yes again. The officer now has a consent search, the most powerful warrantless search available to law enforcement because it requires no probable cause, no warrant, no exigent circumstances, and no independent legal justification beyond the driver's voluntary agreement. Everything found in that search is admissible. Everything. The firearm in the glove box that the driver forgot was there. The medication in the center console that becomes a DUID investigation. The personal documents that become relevant to an unrelated financial investigation. The smell that the officer claims to have detected once the door was open. The consent search is the end game of the "Is this your car?" sequence when it runs to completion. The ownership confirmation established consent authority. The compliance register established consent psychology. And the driver, who answered 4 words honestly and then agreed to a search because they had nothing to hide, has just produced the most complete warrantless evidence package available without a single piece of independent probable cause having been developed. The question is not 4 words. It is the first move in a sequence that ends in a search. Knowing that, the response to the first move becomes straightforward. Here is the layer that makes the "Is this your car?" question particularly dangerous for drivers operating vehicles they do not own, and it is one that applies to an enormous number of entirely lawful driving situations. When a driver who is not the registered owner of a vehicle answers yes to "Is this your car?", the subsequent registration check produces an immediate discrepancy. The plate comes back to a different name. The officer now has a documented inconsistency between the driver's statement and the vehicle's registration record. That inconsistency justifies further investigation. Who is the registered owner? How did you come to be driving their vehicle? Do you have permission? Can you prove it? Is the owner aware you have the car? In some jurisdictions, operating a vehicle without the owner's documented permission creates exposure to unauthorized use of a vehicle charges. A criminal offense in most states that can range from a misdemeanor to a felony, depending on circumstances. The driver who was simply borrowing their partner's car, driving their parents' vehicle to the grocery store, using a company fleet vehicle, or operating a recently purchased car that has not yet been retitled, none of whom have done anything wrong, has now produced a documented ownership discrepancy through a one-word answer that has made their entirely lawful situation look like an unauthorized vehicle situation. The question, "Is this your car?" answered yes by someone who is not the registered owner, is the single most reliable way to convert a lawful driving situation into a criminal investigation without any independently suspicious conduct having occurred. Here is the constitutional and statutory foundation, and it contains something that will surprise most drivers who have been answering this question reflexively at every traffic stop of their lives. You are legally required to provide certain information during a lawful traffic stop. In most states, you are required to provide your driver's license, your vehicle registration, and your proof of insurance when requested. In some states, you are required to identify yourself by name when lawfully stopped. What you are not required to do is answer investigative questions about the ownership of the vehicle beyond producing the registration document. The registration document contains the answer to the ownership question in the form that the law actually requires. The officer can read the registration. The officer can run the plate. The officer has the information the law entitles him to. What he does not have, what the law does not require you to give him, is a verbal statement that confirms, denies, or explains the ownership relationship in a way that can be used as the predicate for a consent search or a discrepancy investigation. The Fifth Amendment protects you from providing incriminating statements. A verbal ownership confirmation that leads to a consent search that produces criminal evidence is, in retrospect, the most incriminating statement you made at that stop. The document speaks for itself. The document is what the law requires. Your verbal confirmation of what the document says is not required and is not protected by handing the document over. The Fifth Amendment covers your mouth. The registration requirement covers the document. They operate independently. Here is what most drivers do when they hear, "Is this your car?" and neither response protects them. The first driver answers yes immediately and honestly. The car is registered to them. They say so. The officer now has a confirmed owner of record with consent authority to authorize a search. Every subsequent request is directed at the person who just established they have the authority to grant it. The compliance register has been set. The consent sequence has begun. The second driver answers no because the car is not technically registered in their name. It is their spouse's car, their parents' car, a company car, a recently purchased vehicle. They think honesty about the technicality is the right call. What they have done is trigger the follow-up investigation that the no answer always produces. Whose car is it? Do you have permission? Why do not you have documentation? Where is the owner? Can we reach them? The no answer does not end the inquiry. It deepens it, and now the driver is being investigated for potential unauthorized vehicle use without having done anything wrong. The third driver says something like, "Well, it is kind of mine, or it is my wife's, but I use it all the time, or I am buying it from my friend." Every qualifier is additional information. Every explanation is a new set of facts that can be cross-referenced, investigated, and documented. The qualified answer is not safer than the direct answer. It is a longer version of the same problem. There is a fourth path. It is the one that neither confirms nor denies, that responds to the legal question behind the social one, and that puts the encounter back on its required constitutional footing without producing a single usable statement. So here are the exact words. The moment the officer asks, "Is this your car? Whose vehicle is this? Are you the registered owner?" or any variation of an ownership inquiry, you respond this way. "Officer, here is my registration. I am invoking my Fifth Amendment right to decline to answer questions beyond providing the required documents. Am I free to go, or am I being detained?" Say it calmly. Hand over the registration, the license, and the insurance as you say it. Every component of that response is doing specific legal work. "Officer, here is my registration." You are fulfilling the legal requirement. The document that the law requires you to produce is being produced. The officer has the information he is legally entitled to. The registration speaks for itself. It either confirms you as the registered owner or it names the registered owner. Either way, the document has answered the legal version of the question without your verbal statement creating any additional exposure. I am invoking my Fifth Amendment right to decline to answer questions beyond providing the required documents. You are naming the constitutional protection precisely. You are not refusing to produce documents. You are not refusing to identify yourself. You are specifically and precisely declining to answer investigative questions beyond the documentary requirements the law actually imposes. The precision matters because it signals legal awareness without appearing evasive about the document production that is genuinely required. Am I free to go, or am I being detained? The legal hinge. If you are free to go, the encounter ends. If you are being detained, the officer must articulate the independent reasonable suspicion that justifies continued detention, and a registration that either matches or does not match your name is not, standing alone, reasonable suspicion of criminal activity. Both outcomes are better than the verbal ownership confirmation that started the consent sequence. Here is the specific additional language for the most common complication. The driver operating a vehicle they do not own, who hands over a registration in someone else's name and now faces the follow-up inquiry. When the registration comes back to a different name and the officer asks about the discrepancy, your response is, "Officer, I have provided the required documents. I am invoking my Fifth Amendment right to remain silent on any further questions. Am I free to go, or am I being detained?" Do not explain the ownership relationship. Do not identify the registered owner. Do not volunteer that you have permission. Do not explain why the registration is in someone else's name. Every one of those explanations, however truthful and however innocent, is a statement that the officer will document, cross-reference, and use to evaluate whether your account is consistent with what the registered owner says when contacted, consistent with the vehicle's history, and consistent with any other information the investigation surfaces. Your truthful explanation of a completely lawful situation is going to be tested against evidence you cannot see and witnesses you do not know have been contacted. The only statement that cannot be tested is the statement that was never made. The Fifth Amendment exists precisely for this moment. the moment when an innocent person, in a completely lawful situation, is being asked to explain themselves in a context where the explanation is going to be evaluated by someone whose job is to find a problem with it. The officer will push back, and at an ownership question stop the pushback is usually framed as administrative necessity. He just needs to verify who is driving the vehicle for the record. Know every variation before it arrives. If the officer says, "I just need to confirm who is driving the vehicle," the license and registration confirm who is driving the vehicle. The documents have answered the administrative question. Your verbal confirmation is not additionally required. Your response does not change. If the officer says, "The registration comes back to a different name," I need you to explain that. Registration in another person's name does not, standing alone, constitute reasonable suspicion of unauthorized vehicle use. Your response does not change. Officer, I have provided the required documents, and I am invoking my Fifth Amendment right to remain silent on further questions. Am I free to go, or am I being detained? If the officer says, "If this is your car, you should have no problem saying so," the logic that an innocent person has nothing to lose by confirming ownership is the same logic that produces consent searches, documented discrepancies, and criminal charges from entirely lawful situations. Your response does not change. If the officer says, "I need to contact the registered owner before I can let you go," contacting the registered owner is a permissible investigative step if the officer has developed independent reasonable suspicion of unauthorized use. Your silence does not provide that suspicion. Your response does not change. If the officer asks for consent to search following the ownership exchange, "Officer, I do not consent to any search of this vehicle." Clear. On camera. Without qualification. If handcuffs come out, "I want an attorney." For words. Everything stops. Here is a dimension of the "is this your car" question that almost no one addresses, and it is one that affects passengers in the vehicle as much as the driver. When the ownership question is asked and the driver answers, passengers are typically silent observers of an exchange they believe has nothing to do with them. In reality, the ownership exchange determines something that directly affects every person in the vehicle who has the legal authority to consent to a search. Under the Fourth Amendment, a person who has common authority over or a sufficient relationship to a place or container can consent to its search. In United States v. Matlock, the Supreme Court established that a third party with common authority over property can consent to its search in ways that are binding on others who share that authority. In Georgia v. Randolph, the court held that when a physically present co-occupant objects to a search, that objection overrides another occupant's consent. What this means in practice at a traffic stop is this. If the driver confirms ownership and consents to a search, the passengers are subject to that search unless they actively and explicitly object. A passenger who says nothing while the driver consents has not objected. Their silence is not a refusal. Their presence in a vehicle being searched pursuant to the driver's consent does not give them independent protection. Every passenger in a vehicle where the driver is being asked, "Is this your car?" has a stake in whether the ownership confirmation produces a consent search, because the consent that follows will cover them too. A passenger who understands this will say, clearly and calmly, before any consent is given, "I do not consent to any search of this vehicle." On camera, before the driver says yes to anything. The body cam captures the ownership question exchange from the first word, and it is one of the most carefully reviewed segments of footage in any case that involves a consent search, because the consent's validity rides entirely on what was said and what was meant in the moments before the driver agreed to the search. Courts examining consent search challenges look at the totality of circumstances, whether the consent was knowing and voluntary, whether it was produced by coercive conditions, and whether the driver understood that they had the right to refuse. A driver who confirmed ownership and then consented to a search on footage that shows no coercion, no pressure, and a seemingly calm and cooperative exchange, that driver has an uphill consent challenge. A driver who produced the required documents, invoked the Fifth Amendment on verbal questions, stated non-consent to any search, and asked whether they were free to go. That driver on that footage looks like someone who understood their rights, exercised them precisely, and gave the officer nothing beyond what the law required. The contrast between those two recordings is the contrast between a successful suppression motion and a failed one. The ownership question is 4 words. The response is the decision that determines which recording exists. Memorize these before you close this video. When the officer asks, "Is this your car?" or any ownership variation, hand over your documents and say, "Officer, here is my registration. I am invoking my Fifth Amendment right to decline to answer questions beyond providing the required documents. Am I free to go or am I being detained?" If the registration is in another name and follow-up comes, "Officer, I have provided the required documents and I am invoking my Fifth Amendment right to remain silent on further questions. Am I free to go or am I being detained?" If he pushes, "Officer, I once again invoke my Fifth Amendment right to remain silent and I will not answer further questions without my attorney present." If consent to search is requested, "Officer, I do not consent to any search of this vehicle." If you are a passenger, "I do not consent to any search of this vehicle," before the driver answers anything. If handcuffs come out, "I want an attorney." 5 positions, all grounded in the Fifth Amendment, Georgia versus Randolph, Rodriguez versus United States, and the documented reality of how the ownership confirmation functions as the predicate to a consent search. None of them require lying. None of them require explaining. All of them require knowing that 4 words are never just 4 words and that the document in your glove box already answered everything the law required. This is educational content only and does not constitute legal advice. Always consult a licensed attorney in your jurisdiction for guidance specific to your circumstances. If this video reached you before an officer ever asked you those 4 words, it did exactly what it was built to do. Subscribe to this channel right now, because "Is this your car?" is one of the most common and least examined questions at a traffic stop, and it sits inside an encounter that has a dozen other moments, each with its own legal framework and its own exact words, that this channel covers one by one. 1 scenario, 1 constitutional foundation, 1 set of words, so that when those 4 words come, you are not setting up a consent search with a 1-word answer. You are not creating a registration discrepancy with an honest explanation, and you are not handing the officer the predicate he needed before he ever asked the next question. Subscribe. Share this with every driver you know, and especially with anyone who regularly drives a vehicle that is not registered in their name. A spouse, a child, an employee, a friend borrowing the car. Someone is going to hear those 4 words and say yes without knowing what yes just started. Make sure they know. Make sure they know what to hand over and what to keep. Make sure they go home protected. Stay calm. Stay protected. Stay free.